The morning mist clung to the English countryside like a shroud as Major Francis "Gabby" Gabreski adjusted his oxygen mask inside the cramped cockpit of his Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. It was March 15th, 1943, and the massive fighter, nicknamed Jug by its pilots for its barrel-like fuselage, sat heavy on the tarmac at Royal Air Force Boxstead. Around him, 23 other Thunderbolts of the 56th Fighter Group prepared for what would become one of the most crucial air battles over Nazi-occupied Europe. The Luftwaffe pilots had been mocking the American newcomer for months. Hauptmann Johannes Mackie Steinhoff of Jagdgeschwader 26 had reportedly laughed during a captured pilot interrogation, calling the Thunderbolt a flying brick and too heavy to dance with our Messerschmitts. The German aces, veterans of the Battle of Britain and the Eastern Front, viewed the Americans' latest fighter with contempt. After all, their sleek Messerschmitt Bf 109 Gustavs and Focke-Wulf 190, as had dominated European skies for years. What the Germans didn't understand was the engineering marvel beneath the Thunderbolt's ungainly exterior. Alexander Kartveli, the brilliant Georgian-American designer at Republic Aviation, had built more than just a fighter. He had crafted a flying fortress. The massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, producing over 2,000 horsepower, gave the 7-ton beast unprecedented power. But it was the armament that would soon silence German laughter forever. 8 Browning M2 50-caliber machine guns, each loaded with over 300 rounds of armor-piercing ammunition. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke, commanding officer of the 56th Fighter Group, had studied intelligence reports from the Office of Strategic Services with growing concern. German fighter production was reaching new heights, with factories churning out nearly 1,500 aircraft monthly despite Allied bombing raids. The Luftwaffe's seasoned pilots, men like Major Egon Meyer and Captain Walter Graf Punski-Krupinski, had decades of combined combat experience. They flew with a precision and ruthlessness that had already claimed hundreds of American bombers. As reported in declassified Army Air Forces documents from the National Archives, the P-47's combat debut had been less than impressive. Early missions in April 1943 saw the heavy fighters struggling to climb with their lighter adversaries. German pilots exploited this weakness mercilessly, using their superior climb rate and maneuverability to bounce American formations from above. The Thunderbolt's reputation among American pilots wasn't much better than its standing with the Germans. Many called it a flying anvil and questioned whether it could ever match the proven P-51 Mustang or the nimble P-38 Lightning. But Major Gabreski knew something his critics didn't. During training flights over the English Channel, he had discovered that the Thunderbolt possessed an almost supernatural ability to absorb punishment and keep flying. The massive radial engine, protected by thick armor plating, could take direct hits from 20mm cannon shells and continue running. More importantly, once the Jug reached altitude and built up speed in a dive, nothing in the Luftwaffe inventory could catch it. The radio crackled with the voice of Colonel Donald Blakesley, leading the 4th Fighter Group's P-47 escort mission for a formation of B-17 flying fortresses heading to bomb aircraft factories in Bremen. "Bandits! 11 o'clock high! Looks like the whole damned Luftwaffe's coming down on us!" Through the plexiglass canopy, Gabreski could see the distinctive silhouettes of German fighters dropping out of the sun, a classic Luftwaffe tactic perfected during the Spanish Civil War. Messerschmitt 109s, with their angular wings, and Focke-Wulf 190s with their broad radial engines, dove toward the bomber formation like swooping hawks. The German pilots were confident, almost casual in their approach. They had faced American fighters before and found them wanting. What they hadn't faced was a pilot willing to use the Thunderbolt's unique advantages. As the first German fighter opened fire on a struggling B-17, Gabreski pushed his throttle forward and felt the massive double-wasp engine respond with a thunderous roar that would soon become the last sound many Luftwaffe pilots would ever hear. Oberleutnant Klaus-Peter Müller of Jagdgeschwader 26 adjusted his gun sight as his Messerschmitt Bf 109, Gustav 6, dove through 8,000 feet, the English countryside spread below like a green patchwork quilt. Behind him, 11 other fighters from the 2nd Staffel followed in perfect formation. Veterans who had cut their teeth over the Channel and seasoned their skills in the frozen hell of the Russian front. Today's mission was routine: intercept the American terror bombers before they reached the Reich's vital industrial centers. The intelligence briefings at their base in Saint-Omer had been dismissive of the new American fighter. Hauptmann Josef Pips Priller, the legendary ace with over 100 victories, had called the P-47 a farmer's tractor with wings. The reports from captured American airmen suggested the Thunderbolt was too heavy, too cumbersome, and too slow in a climb to pose any real threat to experienced German pilots. The Americans, it seemed, had built another flying failure. Miller spotted the bomber formation first, a tight box of 36 B-17 flying fortresses, their aluminum skin glinting in the March sunlight. The flying fortresses were well named. Bristling with 50-caliber machine guns in every direction, they could put up a devastating defensive crossfire. But German tactics had evolved to counter this threat. Fast slashing attacks from head-on, where the bombers had the fewest guns, could break up formations and send the survivors scattered across the sky like frightened sheep. Achtung! Enemy fighters at 2 o'clock level! The warning crackled through his headphones from Feldwebel Heinrich Heinz Bear, flying wing position. Miller's eyes tracked right and slightly down, where he could see the distinctive thick-bodied silhouettes of American fighters climbing desperately to reach the bomber's altitude. Even from 3 miles away, the Thunderbolts looked ungainly, their massive cowlings and stubby wings making them appear more like airborne bathtubs than fighters. The German pilots exchanged knowing glances through their cockpit canopies. These Americans were brave, certainly, but bravery without skill was merely a faster path to death. The Messerschmitt 109, refined through years of combat, could outclimb, outturn, and outmaneuver any American fighter. Its Daimler-Benz DB605 engine, though producing less horsepower than the Thunderbolt's massive radial, powered a machine that weighed nearly 3 tons less. As documented in Luftwaffe combat reports later captured by Allied intelligence, the standard German fighter doctrine emphasized energy management and vertical maneuvering. Pilots like Müller had been trained to use their superior climb rate and acceleration to gain altitude advantage, then dive on enemy formations with devastating effect. The tactic had worked brilliantly against RAF Hurricanes and Spitfires. It should work even better against these lumbering American machines. Major Egon Mayer, leading the formation from his position in a Focke-Wulf 190 Anton IV, gave the attack signal with a sharp waggle of his wings. The German fighters spread into attack formation, a loose line abreast that would allow each pilot to select his own target while maintaining mutual support. Mayer himself, with 68 confirmed victories, would lead the head-on attack against the bomber formation. The fighters would follow up with attacks from the flanks and rear. Müller felt the familiar pre-combat tension in his shoulders as he armed his weapons. One 20mm MG-151 cannon firing through the propeller hub and 2 13mm MG-131 machine guns mounted above the engine. The Messerschmitt trembled slightly as he pushed the throttle to combat power, the supercharged Daimler-Benz engine responding with a high-pitched whine that every Luftwaffe pilot knew by heart. Below and to the right, the American fighters were still climbing, their formation loose and apparently undisciplined. Müller allowed himself a thin smile. The Americans flew like beginners, bunched together without proper interval, their heavy fighters wallowing through the thin air like submarines trying to surface. In minutes, they would learn why the Luftwaffe had dominated European skies for nearly 4 years. The distance closed rapidly as both formations approached each other at a combined speed of over 600 miles per hour. Miller could see individual aircraft details now, the distinctive star and bar markings on the American wings, the spinning propellers of the B-17s, and the frantic maneuvering of the Thunderbolt pilots as they struggled to gain altitude. What he couldn't see was the grim determination in Major Gabreski's eyes as the American ace prepared to rewrite the rules of aerial combat. The collision of the two fighter formations occurred at 18,000 feet above the Hampshire countryside, a violent ballet of metal and fire that would be remembered as one of the pivotal moments in the air war over Europe. Major Francis Gabreski, leading the second element of the 56th Fighter Group, had been waiting for this moment since his first frustrated encounter with German fighters 3 weeks earlier, when his Thunderbolt had been too slow to catch a fleeing Messerschmitt. Today was different. Gabreski had learned to use his aircraft's strengths instead of fighting its weaknesses. As Oberleutnant Müller's Messerschmitt dove toward the bomber formation, the Polish-American ace pushed his Thunderbolt into a shallow dive, trading altitude for the speed that would transform his flying anvil into a hammer of unprecedented power. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine responded with a deep-throated roar, propelling 7 tons of aircraft and pilot through the thin air at over 400 miles per hour. Miller never saw him coming. The German pilot was focused on the lead B-17 of the bomber formation, his gun sight centered on the Fortress's engine nacelle, when 8 streams of 50-caliber tracers suddenly filled his peripheral vision. Each Browning machine gun fired at a rate of 800 rounds per minute, creating a cone of destruction that no aircraft could survive. The armor-piercing rounds, each weighing nearly 2 ounces, struck the Messerschmitt's left wing at the root with the force of sledgehammers. The effect was catastrophic. The wing folded upward like paper, fuel streaming from ruptured tanks in a bright mist that instantly ignited in the slipstream. Müller had perhaps 2 seconds to register what was happening before his fighter disintegrated around him, the fuselage breaking just aft of the cockpit. The German pilot's parachute deployed automatically as he was thrown clear, but his fighting days were over, along with his preconceptions about American fighters. As recorded in the after-action reports filed by the 8th Air Force Historical Section, the engagement lasted less than 12 minutes, but its consequences would reshape the air war over Europe. Captain Walter Hawk Wells of the 61st Fighter Squadron caught a Focke-Wulf 190 attempting to break away from the bomber formation, using his Thunderbolt's superior high-altitude performance to run down the German fighter in a stern chase that covered 30 miles of English countryside. The Focke-Wulf pilot, Unteroffizier Hans Strehlow, tried every evasive maneuver in the Luftwaffe handbook. His radial-engined fighter could normally outturn any American aircraft, but at altitude, the Thunderbolt's turbo-supercharged engine gave it an edge that German pilots had never encountered. Wells closed methodically, his 8 machine guns chattering in short, precise bursts that walked up the length of Strehlow's aircraft like deadly footsteps. The first burst shattered the Focke-Wulf's canopy and wounded the pilot in the shoulder. The second burst severed hydraulic lines and damaged the aileron controls. The third burst found the engine, and BMW 139 radial engine erupted in black smoke and orange flame. Strehlow bailed out over Dover, becoming one of the first Luftwaffe pilots to experience firsthand the Thunderbolt's devastating firepower. But it was Lieutenant Robert Bob Johnson who provided the day's most dramatic lesson in Thunderbolt durability. The 22-year-old pilot from Lawton, Oklahoma, had been jumped by 3 Messerschmitt 109s while protecting a damaged B-17, struggling to maintain formation. The German fighters, led by Lieutenant Fritz Losigkeit, attacked in sequence, their combined cannon and machine gun fire riddling Johnson's Thunderbolt with over 200 holes. Any other Allied fighter would have been destroyed. The Messerschmitt's 20mm cannon shells punched through the Thunderbolt's wing, severed control cables, and shattered instruments across the cockpit. 20mm explosive rounds detonated against the massive radial engine, sending shrapnel through the cowling and into the cockpit. Johnson himself was wounded in the right leg by shell fragments, his flight suit soaked with hydraulic fluid and his own blood. But the Thunderbolt kept flying. The massive double Wasp engine, protected by thick armor plating and redundant systems, continued running despite taking direct hits that would have stopped any liquid-cooled engine cold. The aircraft's robust construction, designed around the philosophy that a fighter must survive to fight another day, proved its worth in the crucible of combat. Johnson nursed his battered Thunderbolt back across the channel, landing at RAF Manston with his gear extended manually and his engine smoking but still running. The mood in the Luftwaffe operations room at Saint-Omer had shifted dramatically by the evening of March 15, 1943. Hauptmann Josef Prehler stood before a large map of northwestern Europe, red pins marking the locations where German fighters had been shot down during the day's operations. 7 aircraft lost, with only 2 pilots recovered alive. Against American heavy, 100 new aviators monthly. The mathematics were inexorable. The Luftwaffe was consuming experienced pilots faster than it could replace them, while American pilot training programs were graduating thousands of new airmen every month, each backed by seemingly unlimited industrial capacity. The laughter that had once echoed through German ready rooms had been replaced by the grim silence of professionals who understood they were fighting a losing battle against an enemy that combined superior numbers with increasingly sophisticated tactics. The winter of 1943 marked the complete reversal of air power over Western Europe, as the once feared Luftwaffe found itself increasingly on the defensive against swarms of American P-47 Thunderbolts that seemed to multiply with each passing month. What had begun as scattered encounters between individual aircraft had evolved into massive aerial battles involving hundreds of fighters on each side, with the Americans consistently demonstrating superior coordination, firepower, and most crucially, an apparently inexhaustible supply of replacement aircraft and pilots. Major Egon Mayer, the German ace who had initially dismissed the Thunderbolt as a flying brick, was shot down and killed on March 2, 1944, during an engagement with the 56th Fighter Group over Berlin. His death symbolized more than just the loss of an individual pilot. It represented the end of an era when German fighter pilots could approach air combat with confidence in their tactical and technological superiority. The man who claimed Mayer's life was Captain Walker Bud Mahurin of the 56th Fighter Squadron, flying a P-47 nicknamed Spirit of Atlantic City. Mahurin's after-action report, preserved in the National Archives, described the encounter with clinical precision. Engaged Single Me 109 at Angels 22. Enemy aircraft attempted climbing turned to starboard. Closed to 200 yards and fired 4-second burst. Observed strikes on engine and cockpit area. Enemy aircraft entered vertical dive with heavy smoke trail. No shoot observed. What the dry military language couldn't convey was the revolutionary nature of the engagement. Mayer, with over 100 confirmed victories and nearly a decade of combat experience, had been outfought by an American pilot with less than 6 months of operational flying. The German ace's superior individual skill had been negated by superior American tactics, training, and equipment, working in perfect combination. By spring 1944, German pilots faced a nightmare scenario that would have seemed impossible just 18 months earlier. American fighter formations regularly penetrated hundreds of miles into German airspace, conducting aggressive sweeps designed specifically to destroy the Luftwaffe's remaining experienced pilots. The Thunderbolts, now equipped with external fuel tanks that extended their range to over 800 miles, could escort bombers all the way to targets in eastern Germany and return with enough fuel and ammunition to engage any German interceptors they encountered. As documented in the personal memoir of Colonel Johannes Steinhoff, published decades after the war, German pilots had developed an almost superstitious dread of encounters with certain American squadrons. The 56th Fighter Group, in particular, had achieved a reputation for aggressive tactics and exceptional marksmanship that made it legendary even among enemy pilots. Steinhoff wrote, "We came to recognize their aircraft by their markings from great distances, and many pilots would refuse to engage if the odds were not overwhelmingly in our favor. The psychological warfare was as devastating as the physical destruction." Colonel Francis Gabreski, now the leading American ace in Europe with 31 confirmed victories, had become a household name in Germany, not through propaganda, but through the whispered conversations of pilots who had faced his formation and lived to tell about it. His personal Thunderbolt, bearing the name Gaby in large letters on the cowling, was as recognizable to German pilots as the aircraft of their own aces. The technical evolution of the Thunderbolt had continued throughout the winter, with newer models incorporating lessons learned from combat experience. The P-47 Delta featured improved armor protection, upgraded engines producing over 2,400 horsepower, and most ominously for German pilots, improved gun sights that made accurate shooting possible at longer ranges. American factory workers, many of them women who had replaced men called to military service, were producing these advanced fighters at a rate that German intelligence analysts found almost impossible to believe. Lieutenant General Jimmy Doolittle, commanding the 8th Air Force, had implemented a new tactical doctrine that turned the air war on its head. Instead of simply escorting bombers defensively, American fighters were now ordered to actively seek out and destroy German aircraft wherever they could be found. The famous phrase, "destroy the enemy air force," had become the guiding principle of American air strategy, and the Thunderbolt had proven to be the perfect instrument for implementing this aggressive approach. The hunters had become the hunted, and the laughter of German pilots had been replaced by the deadly serious business of survival. The spring of 1944 witnessed the complete collapse of German air superiority over Western Europe, as the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt achieved what many military historians would later consider the most decisive air campaign in modern warfare. The massive American fighter, once mocked by German pilots as inadequate for serious combat, had systematically dismantled the Luftwaffe's experienced pilot corps through a combination of overwhelming firepower, superior numbers, and tactics refined through months of bitter combat experience. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, over 2,000 Allied fighters, including nearly 800 Thunderbolts, provided air cover for the Normandy invasion. German air opposition was negligible. The Luftwaffe could muster fewer than 300 serviceable fighters for the entire Western Front. The once proud force that had terrorized Europe now cowered in hidden airfields, its surviving pilots demoralized, and its aircraft increasingly primitive compared to American technology. Major Francis Gabreski's final victory came on July 5, 1944, when he shot down his 28th German aircraft over occupied France. The engagement lasted less than 30 seconds. A Focke-Wulf 190, attempting to escape a strafing attack on a German airfield, was caught in a climbing turn and destroyed by a single burst from Gabreski's 8 machine guns. The German pilot, Lieutenant Klaus Weber, had been flying for less than 2 months, a replacement fresh from training schools that could no longer provide adequate preparation for combat against experienced American pilots. The transformation was complete and irreversible. Where German pilots had once possessed overwhelming advantages in training, experience, and aircraft quality, they now faced American pilots who were equally well trained, flying superior aircraft, and backed by an industrial system that could replace losses faster than the Luftwaffe could inflict them. As recorded in captured German documents from the Oberkommando der Luftwaffe, pilot training programs had been reduced from 18 months to 6 months, then to 3 months, and finally to mere weeks as fuel shortages and the need for immediate replacements forced desperate compromises in preparation standards. The 850 caliber machine guns that had once seemed like overkill to American designers proved to be exactly what was needed to achieve decisive air superiority. Each burst from a Thunderbolt carried the kinetic energy equivalent of a small artillery shell, capable of destroying any German aircraft with surgical precision. The psychological impact was equally devastating. German pilots who survived encounters with Thunderbolts spoke of the terrifying sound of 50 caliber rounds tearing through metal and the sight of tracers converging like deadly lightning bolts. Colonel Hubert Zemke, reflecting on the transformation during a post-war interview preserved in the Air Force Historical Research Agency archives, observed, "We started the war thinking we needed the most maneuverable fighter possible. We ended it understanding that what we really needed was the most lethal fighter possible. The Thunderbolt taught us that in modern air combat, the aircraft that can deliver the most firepower most accurately wins the engagement." By August 1944, the statistical evidence of the Thunderbolt's dominance was overwhelming. American fighter pilots in P-47s had achieved a kill ratio of nearly 8-to-1 against German fighters, an unprecedented level of tactical superiority in air-to-air combat. The 56th Fighter Group alone had claimed over 670 confirmed victories while losing fewer than 60 aircraft in combat. Individual pilots like Captain Robert Johnson had survived combat tours that would have been impossible in earlier periods of the war, flying over 90 missions and returning home to train new pilots in the tactics that had proven so devastatingly effective. The final German laugh at the P-47 Thunderbolt came not from contempt but from bitter irony. General Major Adolf Galland, in his memoirs written after the war, admitted, "We laughed at the Americans' flying bathtub because we could not imagine that brute force could overcome finesse in air combat. We learned too late that when brute force is applied with intelligence and determination, finesse becomes irrelevant. The Americans built a fighter that could absorb our best efforts to destroy it and reply with firepower that made survival impossible. In the end, we stopped laughing because there was nothing left to laugh about." The Republic P-47. Thunderbolt had accomplished what no previous fighter aircraft had achieved: the complete systematic destruction of an experienced, well-equipped enemy air force through superior firepower, tactics, and industrial backing. The massive fighter that German pilots had once dismissed as a harmless jug had become the instrument of the Luftwaffe's defeat, proving that in modern warfare, engineering excellence combined with tactical innovation could overcome even the most experienced and skilled opposition. When the guns fell silent in May 1945, over 15,000 Thunderbolts had been produced, and they had achieved air-to-air victories against every type of German aircraft in service. The laughter of German pilots had been replaced by respectful silence, then by the quiet of defeat. The P-47 had written the final chapter in the story of German air superiority, its 8 machine guns providing the punctuation marks that ended the Luftwaffe's dominance over European skies forever. The thunder had spoken, and the Reich had listened in stunned final silence.
Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, the Navy's leading ace with 34 confirmed victories, reflected on the transformation he had witnessed from the Hellcat's combat debut to the war's end. The aircraft that had initially been viewed with skepticism by pilots accustomed to more agile fighters had become the instrument of complete American aerial domination. Its combination of firepower, durability, and performance had proven ideally suited to Pacific combat conditions. The human cost of this technological transformation had been staggering for Japanese aviation. Veteran pilots like Saburo Sakai, who had survived the entire war, represented a tiny fraction of the air crews who had begun the conflict with such confidence. The majority of Japan's experienced aviators had been lost in the grinding attritional warfare that followed the Hellcat's introduction, leaving inexperienced replacements to face increasingly hopeless odds against superior opponents. Captain Minoru Genda, the tactical genius behind many of Japan's early aerial victories, recognized that the Hellcat had fundamentally altered the nature of Pacific air combat. American pilots no longer needed to match Japanese individual skill levels. Their aircraft provided such overwhelming advantages that tactical competence was sufficient to achieve victory against even experienced opponents. The democratization of aerial combat effectiveness had nullified Japan's traditional reliance on elite pilot training. As documented in post-war strategic assessments, the F-6F Hellcat's impact extended far beyond individual combat encounters. By achieving and maintaining air superiority throughout the Pacific, American naval aviation had enabled the island-hopping campaign that brought Allied forces to Japan's doorstep. Without the protection of Zero fighters, Japanese garrisons had been systematically isolated and destroyed, their supply lines severed by American submarines and surface forces operating under friendly air cover. The economic implications were equally devastating. Japan's inability to maintain air superiority over its own shipping lanes had created supply shortages that crippled both military operations and civilian morale. The Zero, designed for short, decisive conflicts that would establish Japanese dominance before enemies could respond effectively, had proven inadequate for the prolonged industrial warfare that the Pacific conflict had become. As the Emperor prepared to announce Japan's surrender, the symbolic importance of aerial warfare's outcome could not be ignored. The nation that had begun the war with supreme confidence in its aerial superiority was ending it with virtually no air force remaining. The F-6F Hellcat had not just defeated the Zero, it had eliminated the military capability that Japanese strategists had considered essential for victory in the Pacific War. The morning mist clung to San Francisco Bay as Captain Alex Vraciu taxied his F-6F-5 Hellcat toward the decommissioning area at Naval Air Station Alameda on September 20th, 1945. The war had ended just weeks earlier, and already the massive demobilization of American military forces was underway. Around him, hundreds of Hellcats sat in neat rows, their combat days over, awaiting their fate in a peacetime world that would have little use for such instruments of warfare. Vraciu's own Hellcat bore the scars of 3 years of Pacific combat, patched bullet holes, faded paint, and the small rising sun symbols below the cockpit that marked 19 confirmed victories against Japanese aircraft. Each symbol represented not just a tactical success, but a small piece of the larger story of how American industrial might and tactical adaptation had overcome initial Japanese advantages in the Pacific War. The final tallies told a story that would have seemed impossible when the first Hellcats rolled off Grumman's production lines. F-6F aircraft had been credited with destroying over 5,000 Japanese aircraft during their combat service, achieving kill ratios that demonstrated overwhelming technological and tactical superiority. The Zero, which had begun the war as the world's most feared fighter aircraft, had fallen victim to an American design philosophy that prioritized pilot survival and mission effectiveness over elegant minimalism. Rear Admiral John McCain, reviewing the Navy's official assessment of Hellcat operations, marveled at the transformation American naval aviation had undergone since Pearl Harbor. The service that had entered the war with obsolescent fighters and defensive tactics had emerged as the world's most capable naval air force, equipped with aircraft that had redefined the standards for carrier-based fighter performance and effectiveness. The human dimension of this transformation was equally remarkable. American pilot training programs had evolved to produce aviators specifically prepared for Hellcat characteristics and Pacific combat conditions. Unlike their Japanese counterparts, who had suffered devastating attrition among experienced personnel, American aircrew losses had been relatively minimal thanks to superior aircraft protection and recovery systems that brought damaged fighters and their pilots home safely. Chief Test Pilot Robert Hall, who had conducted the Hellcat's initial flight tests, reflected on the engineering philosophy that had made such success possible. The decision to prioritize durability and firepower over maneuverability had proven prescient in Pacific conditions, where engagements often occurred at high speeds and long ranges that negated traditional dogfighting advantages. The Hellcat's robust construction had enabled tactics impossible in more fragile aircraft. The strategic implications of Hellcat operations extended far beyond individual combat statistics. By achieving air superiority throughout the Pacific, American naval aviation had enabled the amphibious campaigns that brought Allied forces to Japan's doorstep. The Zero's inability to contest American air operations had doomed Japanese garrisons throughout the region, creating the conditions that made eventual victory inevitable. As referenced in comprehensive post-war analyses, the F-6F Hellcat represented more than successful aircraft design. It embodied American industrial advantages and tactical flexibility that Japanese planners had consistently underestimated. The ability to rapidly produce, deploy, and continuously improve combat aircraft had proven decisive in a prolonged conflict that favored nations with superior manufacturing capacity and technological resources. The irony was not lost on surviving Japanese pilots like Saburo Sakai, who had initially dismissed the Hellcat as another example of American reliance on brute force over finesse. The aircraft they had mocked for its ungainly appearance and heavy construction had systematically destroyed the Air Force that had once seemed invincible. The elegant Zero, designed for short, decisive engagements, had proven inadequate for the grinding attritional warfare that characterized the Pacific theater. As Vracheu shut down his Hellcat's engine for the final time and climbed out of the cockpit, he carried with him memories of a transformation that had reshaped not just American naval aviation, but the entire balance of power in the Pacific. The F-6F Hellcat had laughed last, sweeping the legendary Zero from skies that had once seemed to belong to the rising sun forever. The age of American aerial dominance had begun, built on the wings of an aircraft that had turned Japanese laughter into the silence of defeat.